there's this period of time where animals regulate their weight. They can eat more and they'll just burn more, or they exercise more and then they'll just eat more, and they maintain body weight. But there's a period where suddenly that changes. What was the switch that converts an animal from skinny to fat? Well, if we could figure out this switch, maybe we could figure out the cause of obesity in humans. And it turns out that there's one nutrient that seems to drive fat. The nutrient turns out to be fructose, which is our carbohydrate. The two major sources of fructose in the United States are table sugar, which is sucrose, and high fructose corn syrup. There's this really unbelievable thing where if it's just a tiny bit more sweet, you don't realize it, but you tend to eat it more.
Hey there, welcome to the Happy Habit Podcast. I'm Matthew. I'm here every week talking health and well-being. If you're enjoying these episodes, please show your support by liking, subscribing and sharing with other people who you think might enjoy these episodes too. We're aiming for 3,000 YouTube subscribers. Hopefully we'll get there in the coming weeks. If you've not already subscribed and you consume this content on YouTube, well then hit that subscribe button. While sugar is recognised as a key driver of disease across the world, the emphasis has often been on glucose. And in today's episode, I speak with Dr. Richard Johnson on the role of another form of sugar, namely fructose. We hear how fructose historically played a key role in helping animals prepare for a scarcity of food. We explore why animals start foraging for food when they consume fructose. Dr. Johnson tells us about the important fructose switch that he believes lies at the heart of the current obesity epidemic. We also hear why Dr. Johnson believes fructose consumption and its ability to change the human brain is responsible for conditions like ADHD and other neurological conditions. Plus, we hear what kind of diet we should be consuming in order to mitigate against the damaging health effects of sugar. Can we start by talking about sugar, namely fructose, and how historically it was meant to prepare animals for scarcity or crisis?
So, it turns out that obesity is actually something that is occasionally desired in nature. And obesity is a way of storing energy. And so animals will become obese at certain times of the year to help them survive when there's not a lot of food around. And when that happens, they'll break down the fat to generate not just calories, but water. And so there are a variety of animals that will purposely become fat during times of food scarcity or even when there's not a lot of water around. So let me just give you a few examples first. The classic one, which we all know, is the hibernating animal. You know, the hibernating brown bear. I was just in Alaska last week looking at these guys, and these brown bears will hibernate during the winter. And what they'll do is they stay lean all summer long. They stay pretty lean. And in fact, I just saw them eating tons of salmon, but they weren't really gaining weight. They were eating a kind of a high protein meal that maybe increases muscle, but doesn't have as much of an effect on weight. But in the fall, they start eating large amounts of berries. And like 10,000 berries in a day. And that is like a huge slug of sugar, because there's sugar in fruit. And that sugar triggers the animal to suddenly get hungry. And then they eat out of control and gain huge amounts of weight. They develop all the features of metabolic syndrome, actually. So, things like insulin resistance, which many people think of as pre-diabetes. It's something that we don't want. You wouldn't expect an animal in nature to want to be insulin resistant. But actually, when you're insulin resistant, your blood glucose levels are high, and that helps you when you're starving because the brain needs glucose. And also it stores fat, not just in the fat tissues, but in the liver, in the blood. Blood pressure, it's helped to be maintained, and all these things are turned on to try to keep the animal alive. And so the bear will hibernate and will drop its metabolism so that it will slowly burn the fat through the winter. And it can go 6 months, 8 months without urinating, without eating, without pooping, the whole, and yet it's metabolizing that fat slowly to keep it going so it doesn't need to eat. It's also true for animals that fly long distances, like there's this godwit is the name of a bird that lives up in Alaska and a Northwest, and it's will eat a variety of different things, but what will happen is it likes to migrate in the colder months. It likes to migrate and make it all the way to Australia, and it can fly thousands of miles without stop. And the only way it can do that is to store a lot of fat, which then it breaks down the fat and produces the calories and water it needs. Butterflies do it. Insects that become dormant do it. Nesting animals, the penguin will get really fat when it nests because it can't leave the nest. So it's like a part of nature. And there are even animals, there's like primates called lemurs that live in Madagascar. These guys are, during the dry season, they can have trouble finding water. So they will hibernate in the summer. We call it estivation. And they will find a hollow in a tree and they will live off their fat. And they use it to produce water. And animals in the desert use fat for water, like camels, and use the hump. And whales in the ocean, marine mammals, many of them don't drink salt water. So they get their fresh water from the food they eat, but some of the water they get from the fat they have. So fat is a wonderful thing at times, but if you get too fat, even in nature, then you'll be the slowest animal in the herd, and you're the first one the predator will get. So there's this, you don't want to be too fat, but you want to be fat at the right time. So our group was very interested in this whole process because we realized that it kind of put a different light on things. Fat can be good. Fat can be a survival mechanism. It isn't just that we want to get rid of fat, but fat can help. And actually there's data that if you're a little bit fatter, you can survive a cancer better. You can survive heart failure better if you have a little bit extra weight. And actually, after the age of 70, the people who live longest are the ones who have a body mass index of about 26. So you don't want to be too fat. But what we would call overweight, by definition of the BMI, actually is associated with living longer once you get to be like 70. So these kinds of things made me realize that it'd be very, very interesting to find out what was the switch that converts an animal from skinny to fat. Because in all of these systems, maybe not so much in the animals living in the sea and so forth, but even there it's true, actually. But there's this period of time where animals regulate their weight. They can eat more, and they'll just burn more, or they exercise more, and then they'll just eat more, and they maintain their body weight. But there's a period where suddenly that changes. So we realized it was a switch, that there's a switch in which animals will suddenly become fat. And we thought, well, if we could figure out this switch, maybe we could figure out the cause of obesity in humans. And so for the last 20 years, I've been doing research on this, and we have identified this switch. And we do think it is what drives obesity in humans. It's a big deal. Not everyone necessarily agrees with me. There's still controversy, but our hypothesis and the data are very strong. And we've been able to weather almost anyone. I mean, we've not had anyone prove us wrong. And we presented at top conferences and published in top journals. So the question is, what is the switch? And it turns out that there's one nutrient rules all, right? There's one nutrient that seems to drive fat. And it's not that other foods can't drive fat too, but there's one that activates the switch. And it's the only food that lowers the energy in a cell rather than raises. So normally when you eat, you want to increase your energy. That's why we eat, right? We're trying to create energy. But there's actually two types of energy. There's what we've already kind of alluded to it. There's the energy we use to do things, and then there's the energy we store. And the total of that is your total energy. If you have excess in fat, you actually are storing energy. And your total body energy is high because you've got all this energy in your tissues. Unfortunately, you're not using it. And so the energy that's the active energy, the energy we use, is often low in people with obesity. So if you biopsy a muscle or liver of a person who's overweight, the energy levels tend to be either normal or low, what we call ATP, the active energy. Whereas in a person who's lean, the energy is almost always normal or high. So there's this thing that shifts the energy in a cell down while increasing the energy, the stored energy. So the active energy goes down and the stored energy or fat goes up. And this makes sense because then the animal becomes a little bit less active, so it's not going to burn the energy and it's going to store more. And this is going to help it when there's no food around. So this happens before the food's gone. Once the food's gone, there's nothing you can do except live off your fat. But if you're a wise animal, and nature developed this technique, when you're prepared, when you know that winter is coming, that's when you want to put on the fat. Because once winter's there, there's no food around to eat, like the grasshopper and the ant. So the way this works is the nutrient turns out to be fructose, which is a carbohydrate. And there's really two major carbohydrate sugars that the body uses. One is glucose and the other is fructose. And glucose is what everyone talks about. It circulates in our blood. If it's high, we're diabetic. If it's low, we're hypoglycemic. We try to maintain those glucose levels. The glucose is like the favorite carbohydrate that the body can use other carbohydrates, and use ketones and all kinds of things. But glucose is historically the big fuel. And we have a hormone, insulin, that regulates glucose, and so our focus is on glucose. And if you talk to people, they go, problem is that when the blood glucose levels go up, and you become insulin resistant, that this means you're going to, this is associated with obesity, diabetes, Alzheimer's. And so it kind of makes sense, since glucose comes from carbs, rice and potatoes and bread and sugar, that if we could restrict carbs, we could really have a big impact. And it's really true. And the world discovered the importance of keto diets and low carb diets and intermittent fasting, but the importance of carbs has become very, very apparent. And many people recognize that carbs are driving a lot of disease. The focus for a lot of those people was on glucose. And you know why? Because glucose levels go up. That's associated, developing diabetes. It increases our risk for all these diseases. But what's interesting is, normally when you eat glucose, the glucose level goes up, and insulin goes up, and then the glucose comes down. That's what's supposed to happen. But when you become insulin resistant, the glucose levels are always a little high, even when you're fasting. And when you eat, now the glucose levels go even higher because the insulin's not really working very well. So the interesting thing is that fructose is what causes insulin resistance, not insulin. In other words, insulin's there as a hormone to work, but fructose actually causes insulin resistance. The way fructose works is it lowers the energy in the cell, lowers that ATP by suppressing the factories that make ATP. And when that happens, there's this oxidative stress and all this other stuff that causes the insulin resistance. And our group and others showed that the insulin resistance is clearly driven by the fructose and not so much by the glucose. But once you're insulin resistant, then your insulin levels are high, your glucose levels are high, and all that problem is just the same. Carb restriction will lower the carbs and help. But it's sort of interesting. Glucose is the fuel that stimulates insulin, but fructose is what causes the insulin resistance. And this was one of our early discoveries. So they're both bad, right? Because fructose sets it up, and then you eat the carbs and the glucose levels go up, and that's not good for the brain. I'm actually in agreement with people like Gary Taubes and others who made this strong case that glucose is the problem. It is a problem, but fructose is a problem too. So the biggest thing is, if fructose comes from fruits, honey, gosh, we've always been taught that that's good. And certainly if you're eating fruit, you live longer, right? So there's a disconnect. And that disconnect is because natural fruits contain a lot of really good things that counter the fructose. But as a fruit ripens, the good things go down and the sugar goes up. But one fruit by itself only has like 5-7 grams of fructose, whereas if you drink a soft drink, you get 32 grams or so. So there's a huge difference in amount. And what we proved was that it's really large amounts of fructose that really activate this path. And the large amounts can come from sugar, high fructose corn syrup, and 1 or 2 natural fruits are actually going to be good for you, not bad. We even did clinical trials.
I was just thinking there when you mentioned high fructose corn syrup, I was reminded of the conversation I had with Professor Robert Lustig, who was very vehement in his opposition to the ubiquitousness of high fructose corn syrup, but particularly in ingredients in processed food in North America. Now, we wouldn't use it to the same extent in Europe, but in North America, it seems to be in everything. And of course, as you've said, if fructose is responsible for that switch that causes people to gain fat and gain weight, well, then if it's in everything, well, then that's just going to put that whole process on steroids.
Yeah, that's right. The 2 major sources of fructose in the United States are table sugar, which is sucrose, and high fructose corn syrup. And there's a little bit more fructose in the high fructose corn syrup. And we have done comparisons in animals where we give exactly the same amount, and also in humans. And high fructose corn syrup wins the contest for being worse. And we can go into more detail if you want, but both are bad. Okay. So anyway, but you're totally right. What makes high fructose corn syrup particularly bad is it's often used in a stealth way. So they'll add small amounts to make a food just taste a little better. Because there's this really unbelievable thing where if it's just a tiny bit more sweet, you don't realize it, but you tend to eat it more. Like certain crackers will put just a little bit in it and go, those are really good. Those wheat thins, what's with them? They taste so good. Or for example, I would go to Japanese restaurants or Chinese restaurants, and they'll serve an appetizer that never mentions sugar or high fructose corn syrup. It'll sound healthy, and you'll eat it. And my wife and I, it's just so delicious. And then that's like a trigger, because if it's really delicious, it usually means it's been sweetened a little bit. And then we go, oh my gosh, really, it's sweet. Or like some of the fast food chains, they would add a little this ketchup. When I was a kid, I just loved the ketchup in certain chains like McDonald's. And then one day I realized, many decades later, that that's a little sweeter. So this is a trick that people do, and it's sort of poisons us. But the other big horrible discovery, but it actually fit into the jigsaw puzzle, was, for when I was first doing this, we go, oh my gosh, fructose is unique. It's the nutrient that's doing it. And I even did debates. I did a debate with Gary Taubes once, and I said, yes, glucose is bad, but fructose is what causes insulin resistance, and then glucose is the fuel. And we would debate on it, and, but there was this fighting, for sure. If I cut out bread, if I cut out French fries, which was mainly starch, there's not much sugar in French fries. We know they're not good for you, though, right? We know French fries. I love it, but it's not good for me, and I know it. And if I eat French fries, my weight will go up. Within a day or two, I will see a pound or two go up, and then I have to go on a low-carb binge and get my weight down. And so the question is, why, if it's fructose? And what we found out, and now it's becoming more apparent, is that when you eat high glycemic carbs, or carbs that tend to raise the blood glucose, like bread, right? Beautiful bread, French fries, potatoes, rice, cereal, things that a lot of people like. I mean, I just love bread. And when you eat that, your blood glucose goes up after the meal. And if you have a glucose monitor, you can actually show that certain foods will raise your blood glucose. And it's kind of the normal response to those foods. And some people have a big response and some have a small response. So that's why groups like, are selling these glucose monitors so you can see which foods you're sensitive to. But when the glucose goes up, some of that glucose gets converted to fructose. And what we now know is that normally about 3% gets converted, but if you've activated the switch, you'll be converting up to 30% of that glucose. So a lot of the glucose gets converted to fructose.
While we're talking about conversion of glucose to fructose, that's exacerbated if you add salt to your meal too.
Yes, there's three triggers. Well, there's many triggers actually, but the three triggers are salt, alcohol, and uric acid, high uric acid. And most people who are overweight will develop a high uric acid, so they can convert it's sort of self-defeating. Once you develop metabolic syndrome, you will convert glucose to fructose more easily. Yeah, so high uric acid, salt, and alcohol are the three that I meant. But mild dehydration, not severe dehydration, mild dehydration will activate it too. And the easiest way to get mildly dehydrated is to eat salt, because it makes you thirsty. And it's really when you're thirsty that this thing happens, because fat's a source of water. So it makes sense to build up fat. Anyway, so when you convert carbs to fructose, that's probably as important as sugar. Sugar and high fructose corn syrup are probably the principal drivers, right? Especially in the U.S., where they make up 15% of the diet. But for many parts of the world where people are more careful about sugar, probably the greater risk is like from high glycemic carbs coupled with salt or alcohol. So, so I think that this sort of tells the story, and we've been, trying to figure out how it works, how to block it. and supplements that might be helpful, sugar substitutes that might be helpful. And so, maybe we can focus a little bit on some of those things too.
Sure. Just before we come to solutions, you mentioned earlier about foraging bears and about eating tons and tons of berries. And I know that the consumption of fructose actually prompts foraging. And this also leads to a behavioral change in the animal. So could you talk to me about this in respect of human beings and how this behavior change and impulsivity affects their own eating habits?
Yes. Oh my gosh, for sure. Yeah. One of the big discoveries with this switch was that it wasn't just metabolic syndrome. It wasn't just a fatty liver and obesity and high blood pressure, but that there are neurologic effects of the switch. And the neurologic effects, well, we know some of them, right? You get hungry, you get thirsty, and we're able to show that that's because you're becoming leptin resistant, so you keep eating. But there's also this incredible effect on what's called foraging. And so when you eat sugar, there is this foraging response that you can show in animals where they start looking for food. And, maybe you notice you have a child and they eat sugar, how they suddenly just like hyperactive and running around. That's sort of a foraging. And they're maybe hungry. It can kind of stimulates hunger. And later on, it will be associated with a crash because the ATP levels fall and that triggers it. So, the foraging response turns out to be a actual neurologic, biologic response. It isn't just like, you just naturally just go out forage for food. There's actually in the brain, certain regions of the brain are being activated and other areas in the brain are being inhibited. And actually, there's a lot of behavior that's foraging is associated with the inhibition of a lot of parts of the brain. So there's an inhibition of the cortex, the rational thinking thing, what we call self-control. That's inhibited. That allows you to be able to venture into areas that you've never been to. So if you're a little chipmunk and you want to go out and find food, and there's no food in the immediate area, it may be scary to go a little farther because you don't know if there's an owl there or a snake or whatever. So you have to not have too strong self-control, and you have to be brave, and you have to be sort of a leader to be able to go out there and find it and bring it back to the other animals. And so foraging is like a heroic response. It's the scout. It's the person who's willing to take risks. And it's really a good thing. And you have to get in, you have to get out, so you have to look around and see everything, and you have to kind of process quickly. You can't focus on anything at any one time. And you need to be upbeat and, be willing to go out there. So it starts off as a brilliant, wonderful thing. The explorers of the world, the discoverers, adventurers. But if you keep activating that process chronically, what happens is suddenly, if you're foraging all the time, you don't have much time to deliberate on anything. You can't focus because you keep moving and you keep looking. And things like attention deficit disorder are now recognized as a foraging response. There was some beautiful studies that showed that people with ADHD actually do better than others when it comes to testing for foraging. They see more. There's actually some some wonderful things with ADHD that people with ADHD have that we don't have. But anyway, but it's not necessarily bad to have some of these behaviors. But on the other hand, it can really interfere with your ability to get work done or to concentrate and to finish things. So ADHD becomes a problem, and as it gets more and more severe, it becomes a problem. And we have linked this with fructose. We've linked it with uric acid, which is produced from fructose. And I've written papers on it. It's also associated strongly with bipolar disease, this pathway. And fructose levels are high in the brains of people with bipolar disease. And you kind of get the big spikes big excitement, and then mania or hysteria, and then big crash. And that's really been linked with sugar. Interestingly, lithium, I was just kind of going over this. Lithium was used for years as a treatment for bipolar disease, and it was thought to be the first one that was effective. And lithium has a big effect on uric acid, and it's interesting that there's now more and more papers suggesting that some of the benefits of the lithium might be from interfering with this very pathway. And in fact, there's been 4 or 5 studies with allopurinol on bipolar disease, which is a drug that lowers uric acid. They all seem to show some benefits there. So it's kind of interesting, that these behavioral things. And the other problem is that the cortex is really involved in thinking. And if you suppress it chronically, you start, and the way it suppresses it, it causes insulin resistance so that the glucose doesn't get into the brain quite so well. And now there's data that that's the early stage of Alzheimer's, and people with Alzheimer's have high fructose levels in their brain. And if you give sugar chronically to animals, they have trouble going through a maze, and you can kind of replicate a lot of the stuff with Alzheimer's, even the amyloid plaques, by giving fructose or sugar to animals. So I think that this kind of metabolic, the basic theme is that something good can be bad if you keep overdoing it. And nature set it up to be a good thing, and we just got really good at harvesting food and generating sugar, and because we've got taste buds that try to make us like it, and seek it out, that it's very easy to just keep eating it. And we're not hibernating. Even when it's cold, we just go into our warm homes and bring the sugar in and keep eating it.
Well, that's it. There's never a scarcity of food that we would have endured certainly thousands of years ago. Let's talk about solutions then. Yeah, you've spent years and years looking at this fat storage switch. What have you learned, and what can people take away from this such that they can address their own fat storage issues?
Well, the first thing is, try to avoid foods that generate a lot of fructose, high glycemic carbs, and sugar, and so forth. Another thing to do is so carb restriction, low carb diets, they will protect you largely. Keto diets, carnivore diets, anything where you can reduce the carbs. Drinking water, staying hydrated has a huge positive effect. And another one that helps is there's recently, and at disclosure, I've been a scientist for 40 years, but we fell upon a low-calorie sugar, a natural sugar, called allulose. And allulose looks like fructose, but it doesn't activate the switch. And we tested it ourselves. And what's interesting is allulose stimulates that same hormone that Ozempic and semaglutide and all these drugs that are being used for weight loss, they stimulate a thing called GLP-1, or glucagon-like peptide 1, and allulose stimulates the body's production of it. And so I started studying this, and with others, we published a few papers on it now. or some are just coming out. But we found that allulose is actually instead of just being a neutral low-calorie sugar, it's actually beneficial, and it can help with weight loss and blood glucose control, blunts the postprandial glucose. So I joined a company called RX Sugar. They make allulose, and I joined it as the science officer to understand it. And it's my goal to do big clinical trials. So I have a, conflict, I guess, but I do think I recommend it. Well, I think it's not actually available in Europe at this point, but if you do go to the U.S. where it's generally regarded as safe and you can buy it, you should just check it out. And you don't have to buy an RX Sugar product. There's other companies that make allulose, but you should check it out because it looks like a beneficial low-calorie sugar. So there's that. There's also things like vitamin C. Vitamin C actually is very good, and it has some effects to block this pathway. Everyone should take 500 milligrams a day. Everyone should. Linus Pauling was right, maybe for the wrong reason, but he always recommended people should be taking more vitamin C. And natural fruits are good, but don't drink fruit juice because that's concentrated stuff. And there's a lot of other things that you can do. I write about it in my book. So I don't want to tell everything, but dark chocolate's good, for example. There are things in the book that for sure that I'm not covering. So.
Well, just briefly, seeing as we're on the subject of fat storage and we're talking about diets and what we can consume in order to reduce our fat content in our body, what about the consumption of fat itself? Where would you view that as far as dietary fat is concerned?
One of our big discoveries, and actually there was some beautiful work done in London on this, is that when you eat the carbs, it makes you hungry. But being hungry doesn't make you fat. You actually need to eat foods that are high in calories to really get fat. So if I make you leptin resistant by giving you fructose or carbs, but I don't give you much food, you're not going to get fat. You'll just be hungry a lot, wandering around a lot, foraging. But if I give you fat with sugar, then the fat is got it's energy dense. It's 9 calories per gram. So you're going to eat that and you're going to gain weight more rapidly. And what this group in London showed was that when you become leptin resistant, which is what fructose does, you actually will seek fat. You'll like high fatty foods. Suddenly you'll want that fried chicken. You want the fried foods because the sugar actually, we don't normally have a taste bud for fat, but when you become leptin resistant, your body seeks high fatty foods. And here's another thing. If you're on no carb, or if you're on a keto diet, you can eat a high fat diet because you don't have the hunger and leptin resistance. You're going to control how much you eat. So you're not going to get fat on a high fat diet if you're on a keto diet. But if you give the carbs to make you leptin resistant and the fat, now you've got a formula for obesity.
It's amazing how the carbs really are the key to everything. And I suppose historically people would have demonized, I've said this a few times on this podcast, people would have demonized dietary fat, but it is the carbs that are causing the problem really. And what you've said today certainly feeds into that narrative.
Yeah, it's a two-hit system, right? The carbs are like making a fire, and then the high fat is kind of like the firewood. And if you make a fire but there's no wood, it's just going to burn out. Or it's going to be a small flame. But if you have a fire and then throw a lot of wood on it, you're going to get a big flame. And if you just put wood alone, you're not going to get anything. So that's sort of how it works.
But you can find out plenty more about this whole discussion in Dr. Richard Johnson's book. It's called Nature Wants Us to Be Fat. It's a great read. Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for tuning into this episode of the Happy Habit Podcast. If you enjoyed it, or indeed any of the previous episodes, show your support like, subscribe, and share with other people who you think might enjoy these episodes too. Until next time, stay happy.